How do our earthly fathers and the relationship we have with them affect our relationship with our Heavenly Father? Join us today as we discuss that question with Dr. Paul Vitz, Senior Scholar at the Institute for Psychological Sciences and author of Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism. I'm Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and you're watching Franciscan University Presents. Stay with us. Welcome to Franciscan University Presents. Today we're going to be talking about the faith of the fatherless, the psychology of atheism. I'm your host, Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement here at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. I'm joined here in the studio by our regular panelists, Dr. Regis Martin, Professor of Systematic Theology here at Franciscan University, Dr. Scott Hahn, who holds the Father Michael Scanlan Chair in Biblical Theology and the New Evangelization, and our special guest today, Dr. Paul Vitz. You've got your undergraduate in psychology from the University of Michigan, PhD in psychology from Stanford. You've taught psychology at the New York University, and you're currently a senior scholar at the Institute for Psychological Sciences for a number of years now.
Right.
Author of many books and articles, including kind of the topic of our show today, Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism. You're married and have 6 children? Is that right?
Six, yes, and 17 grandchildren.
17 grandchildren. Very impressive.
Yes.
Well, thank you for being on the program today.
Great to be here.
Well, how prevalent, since we're talking about atheism, how prevalent is atheism, those who don't believe in God, in American culture today?
Well, it's actually moderately common, and perhaps even growing would be my guess on it.
Okay.
I haven't seen actual statistics on, a random sample and how many, but I'd say it's becoming something of a modest movement.
And is this more of a modern, or is this kind of always been around?
I think what we're seeing today is somewhat new, actually. There's been, atheism in the culture and among certain people for a long time.
Sure.
Let's say for a couple hundred years or so, it's been pretty common in the West in certain strata.
Yeah.
But now it's much more common in the culture at large.
It used to be that everybody had a village atheist, but now the atheist is running the village.
Yes,
I mean,
something
the
like
psalmist
that.
speaks of the fool who says in his heart there is no God. But that level of folly, I think, has become endemic to the culture.
Yes.
I think what you say is true, but possibly understated. I think back to my own undergraduate studies in philosophy in the 70s when Anthony Flew was the voice of the atheist, and a very intelligent voice. Although, in the last 15 years or so before he died, he came around to a kind of Aristotelian theism.
Right.
But in the last 15 years, I think we've seen something new and aggressive, with Dawkins and the God delusion. I think you could almost consult epidemiologists and recognize that atheism is an epidemic. I mean, especially among the young in general and former fundamentalists in particular. Everywhere I go, I meet parents who raise their kids Baptist, who raise their kids fundamentalist, and those kids are now virulent, intelligent, articulate, and aggressive atheists.
Yeah,
and I tell you, it's something that nobody saw coming, And so I would say your work is important now in a way that nobody foresaw 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, not only has it become more aggressive, more
Yes.
pronounced, more strident, but it has become more fashionable, more respectable.
That's right.
I mean, if you announce yourself as an atheist, you're not saying anything unseemly. I mean, people look up to you. You're a clear thinker. You've decided to take a stand against God, who's dead, by the way, or at least missing in action. You're heroic.
Yeah.
Academics who believe in God have changed places in the closet with the atheists who come out.
Yes, I think you're right about the academics in the closet who are believers. That I would say, yes.
And so if you look back, I mean, just to do a contrast, what did it look like even in the beginning of our country? We haven't always had this. This is a modern phenomenon, but I mean, today, for somebody watching the program, it is commonplace to have atheism on the media, in our leadership, and in everything we see and read and find out there, but this wasn't always the case, right? I mean,
definitely not. We were a very religious country when we were founded. We were so religious that when somebody like de Tocqueville came over here and started talking about American democracy and his famous works, he mentioned that as one of the foundational characteristics of America, and that in the United States, being religious was in no way associated with, the old aristocracy and its culture or anything like that. Here it was just assumed. And as recently as as 1896 about, there was a Supreme Court case in which the issue of polygamy came up with respect to the Mormons. And in the rejection of polygamy by the Supreme Court in, I think it was about 1896, they said, among other things, one of their reasons for rejecting it was, we are a Christian nation.
Right.
yeah.
I mean, that's a direct quote.
Yes.
I think we have to step back, and at the risk of embarrassing you, I would say this, that though our country was religious, you weren't growing up, correct?
No, I wasn't.
No,
I wasn't.
You've been
especially
studying atheism now for a long time, and I realize that you've been studying that particular phenomenon, but a lot of people like me have been studying your work for decades, because the work that you did going back to Freud in psychology, and I found very illuminating when it comes to the relationship between God and fatherhood in our own experience growing up. And back in the 70s, one of my professors, R.C. Sproul, wrote a book called The Psychology of Atheism. And it was a philosophical, theological examination, whereas your book is subtitled The Psychology of Atheism.
Yes.
But you're looking at the faithlessness of those who are fatherless.
Right.
And identifying this as the substratum. And it's more than just a sociological phenomenon. It's more than just a psychological factor. It's an all-pervasive feature that has gone largely unrecognized. And at the risk of embarrassing you, I want to underscore the value and importance of this, because I think this is the front door into the real heart of the matter.
Yeah. I think so too. And we've essentially obliterated a positive concept of fatherhood in our society.
Exactly.
And there are many reasons for this. There are many different factors behind it.
Yeah.
But that's the foundational thing. And sometimes it's very particular in the life of an individual, and that's why I talk about many atheists as having had no fathers or bad fathers, dysfunctional fathers. Yeah. But the culture at large doesn't want to, really doesn't want to give fatherhood an emphasis. Somehow or other it's threatening to them.
Right. Well, your narrative is really quite fascinating, and at the heart of it, you have this correlation that I think you've very carefully, meticulously drawn between the tendency to say no to God because your experience of dad was a series of no's. You reject him, and therefore you reject God as father.
Right.
And it's not accidental. I mean, you make the case that it's pretty essential, constitutive of this phenomenon of a fatherless society.
Yes.
And is that really true?
Well, I think in a wide sense, yes. But psychology eventually has to boil down to lots of case histories.
Yeah.
It can, and when you do that, things get much more varied and more complicated. Yeah. But you're right about the cultural issues, about the whole understanding of society, and so on. Yeah. But and by the way, I think men have been pretty much in the avant-garde of abandoning fatherhood. Mm-hmm. And I think they've done this perhaps inadvertently, but significantly because of of what I would call the sexual revolution.
Yeah. Mm.
The whole emphasis on sex is not sex as anything but entertainment. I mean, it's not sex with responsibility.
Right.
And what fatherhood is sex with responsibility.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what we've we've jettisoned when we make sex into something that you just
when I came into
for fun.
When I was coming into the church, I remember reading books in my own time. The sex drive was the phrase back in the 70s and 80s. But in looking at manuals of moral theology written by Catholic theologians back in the 20s and 30s, they didn't use that phrase sex drive ever. What they had was a parental drive, a paternal or a parental desire. Yeah. That was the phraseology. And I thought, well, that's subtle, but I mean, that is substantial. Yeah. To reduce it down to sex and pleasure, or to see it as paternity and parentage. Yeah. I mean, it was a sea change of seismic proportions that went largely unnoticed.
Right. I agree with that completely, and it went unnoticed because the idol of sexuality was held in front of men. Yeah, that's right. And they're now focused on porn and all kinds of things like that.
It's of a piece with a more general flight from authority, from standards, structures that are sort of unalterable. The nature of man, the constitution of being. People are rejecting that, and in their revolt from that, they seize upon sex as a weapon with which to strike God, to hit back at their parents.
To hit back at paternity.
You so oppressed us when we wanted to be free.
And so when we're talking about all this, I mean, the name that clearly comes to mind for me is Sigmund Freud. When we're talking about all of this, right? I mean, so we have some major problems with Freud. Kind of unpack that in light of what you're talking about with atheism in his approach. Is there something that we can learn or benefit from, and what are some of our major problems with Freud in relationship with this?
Yes. Well, look, Freud is best known, and correctly, for having placed a great emphasis on sexuality. Yeah. And by the way, he's the only theory of personality in psychology, the only theorist, his theory, and he's the only theorist who emphasized sexuality at all. Mm-hmm. Carl Jung didn't, Alfred Adler didn't, all the others didn't talk about sex. But for Freud, as people have pointed out, for Freud, sex was the key. Uh-huh. And Freud also, in a way, rejected and didn't respect his father. Mm. Uh-huh. Yeah. And so there the two separate for him. Yeah. His father, he didn't respect his father for various reasons. And Freud himself said, I think I'm quoting it pretty correctly, he said, "Nothing is more common than for a young person to lose their faith in God when they lose respect for their father." Right. Mm. Now, I took that myself and tried to unpack it in my work, because there's nothing in there about God being a projection of anything, or none of his theory is there, but he had that personal insight. Right. And of course, in his own writings, he referred to his father twice, now that we have the original letters, as a sexual pervert.
Wow. So he even modeled for you what you found.
Yes.
Now, you're not a dabbler in Freudian psychology, right?
Yes,
I mean, explain what your background is, just briefly, so we can.
Well, I've read a good deal of Freud. I have to admit to that, and a lot of biographical material too. But my background, I was trained in graduate school as I guess you would say as a cognitive psychologist, an experimental cognitive psychologist. And then when I was hired at NYU, that's the kind of work I did.
Which is what, behavioral or what?
Well, I made models, mathematical, quantitative models of human learning, human perception, things of that kind.
It sounds pretty boring.
I know to you it does. To me, I still look back at what I had let go, and I long for doing some more of it.
When did you stumble upon Freud? I know you resisted making him your patron saint, but he was a presence.
Right. By the way, if there's a patron saint now for what I'm doing, which is now developing a Catholic and Christian understanding of psychology for psychotherapy, if we have a patron saint, it would be John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm. How so?
Yes.
It means that the new psychology should make straight the way for the Lord. Oh. Wow. Our job is to get people out of the prisons that their own defense mechanisms, that their own denials, that their own psychology has put them in. Yep. And when Grode is a little bit more free, and they have more free will. They always have free will, but they'll have more.
Right. Yeah.
When they have that, then our job is done.
Right. So you're really about truth.
Sure.
The business of truth and clarifying people's
The best of psychology really always is.
Right. Yeah.
Even Freud struggled with it. He came up with a lot of partial truths or untruths along the way, but
Well,
came
Augustine
up with some
would
good
be
ones
another
too.
patron saint then. St. Augustine. I mean, the Confessions, that's a kind of psychological work.
Oh, that's a
Examination
wonderful
of the self
psychological work.
in
Yes, it
relation
is.
to God.
It's the first real autobiography in the world, I think.
Yeah, someone said of your work that it's like you did a psychological jujitsu, an academic jujitsu on them, where you used the true Freudian attempts on understanding sex and the drive, but he's missing so many parts of this. But even with like attachment theory and so many other parts of psychology, you're using what often atheists use against those who believe, and actually using it to show this is actually you're displaying for us why.
Yeah, you're projecting. As we psychologists would say, you say that. And what's really interesting is the number of atheists that I've found who say, my atheism is not the result of rational thinking.
Right.
I don't want the world to be that way.
Right, I see.
That's what they say.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not, it's an emotional thing. It's a personal thing. It has nothing to do with reason for Nietzsche or for many other atheists.
Oh, that is awesome. I want to pick this up on the other side. Stay with us on Franciscan University Presents.
The very things that can push someone away from God can send someone running into God's arms. For example, even in infancy, what the developmental psychologist Erickson called the stage of trust versus mistrust, if the relationship with the mother or primary caregiver does not engender a sense of trust and hope, that could be the basis for relationship problems of all sorts, including relationship with God later on.
Not having a father can affect a child's social, emotional, and moral development. But if a child's father is not physically present or emotionally present to them, it doesn't mean that they're doomed to an unhappy life. Be honest with your child. And at the same time, help your child to understand that their self-worth is not solely reliant on their father's involvement in their life.
Study online, on campus, or both in graduate programs for working adults at Franciscan University of Steubenville. Advance your career with the ethical approach to management you'll find in our MBA. Bring online learning to life through our Masters in Education. Prepare for advanced practice nursing with our Masters in Nursing. Check FRANCISCAN.EDU or call 800-783-6220.
People recognize Franciscan University as being academically excellent and passionately Catholic. We have the unique opportunity through our faculty members, through our students, to proclaim that academic excellence by reaching out in many different ways. We also remain passionately Catholic in the way in which we are able to worship, the way in which we are able to bring that love of Christ to others on a daily basis. It's important for us to be able to embrace both.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've been talking about faith of the fatherless, the psychology of atheism with Dr. Paul Vitz. Paul, we ended last session with a quote that kind of was an honest atheist that really brings some real truth to light. It was Nagel, right?
Yes, Thomas Nagel. Yes, he's a very prominent philosopher.
Okay, and so his understanding, just to kind of rephrase that again for us.
Well, he said he knows people who are believers, who are very intelligent and impressive, but he doesn't like the fact that they are believers, and he said the simple fact of the matter is, for him, he doesn't want there to be a God. He doesn't want the universe to be that way.
Yeah, right.
And there was a very honest, frank statement of something that tells you that a great deal of atheism is based upon something besides reason and evidence.
Right.
It has to do with something about what people want in some way, what appeals to their heart, rather than anything to do with what's going on up here in the cortex.
That's terribly important. I mean, it's not as if they've come back fresh from the stacks in the library.
Right.
They've exhausted the question.
Yeah, no, that's
Alas,
right.
there is no God. I just can't find him. But
Yes.
I've done all my best, bent every effort of mine
And it
to locate him.
It confirms the testimony of St. Paul in Romans 1, who attributes atheism not to the lack of evidence in the world, but to the lack of will in the human heart.
Absolutely.
Because of how unsettling it is to recognize if there is a God, then I can't be that, and so much of what he is tracing there has to do with the pride, which is of course not a problem for intellectuals or academics, because in the academy there's very little intellectual pride. Wait a minute.
What?
Yeah, I mean, it is such an occupational hazard. Right?
Yeah, I was listening to NPR a while ago, and they were interviewing Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest, and he said, I've got the good news and I've got the best news. The good news is there's a God, but the best news is he's not me. So, I mean, the atheist cannot abide two gods, so the real God has to be dethroned, displaced, because there's got to be room only for me. So it is a function of the will, the crisis of atheism. We locate it in the heart, in the will.
In fact, I would argue that the growth of atheism today is part of the narcissism endemic to our culture.
Yeah.
That is, the narcissist is a person who can't get outside of their own understanding and their own concerns for what they need. They can't give of themselves well to others. They're not involved normally in loving relationships, in altruistic activities and so on. They're focused almost entirely on themselves.
They're incapable of love because they're the center of their own shrinking universe.
That's with real narcissists. This is not true, of course, of all atheists.
That's right.
I don't want to make that
the
general.
narcissist syndrome.
But the narcissist, yes.
Yeah.
And so when kind of the crux of your book, The Faith of the Fatherless, you use a term, the dead father syndrome.
Yes.
And what relationship does this have to people's belief in a God?
Well, in the case of Nietzsche, for example, his father was dead. And basically when he said God is dead, he was really saying, my dad is dead. And he had loved his father. His father died when Nietzsche was about 4, maybe a little over, and they had a close relationship, which was rather unusual for a young boy in the German culture of that time, but he did. But his father died of a disease, probably some kind of, well, they're not quite sure. They called it softening of the brain, whatever that meant, roughly in the 1870s or 80s. I don't know when. No, maybe 1860s.
That would describe a lot of academics.
Softening of the brain. No.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I'll pass on that one. I'd like to think so, but I hope it isn't an expression of.
But in your book, you describe little Nietzsche, this 4-year-old child, as gripping the hand of his mother at the funeral.
Yes.
So that event must have really traumatized.
Oh, it did. And many of his biographers have pointed out that Nietzsche never got over the death of his father, and that in many ways his search for a father was expressed in his idealization of the Superman, das Übermensch. That was a kind of idealized father that he created, and he talked about himself in all these militant, strong terms, and he was trying to find something to fill that vacuum that was left by his weakening and dying father. And he, therefore, the pale Galilean that Nietzsche would refer to was really his own pale father, who was a minister, by the way, a minister in the Protestant church.
And so we have Nietzsche. You talked about Freud earlier, the dead father. What about just a weak or abusive father? Does that have any?
Oh, sure. That has a lot of problems. Abusive fathers. I don't know if people remember H.G. Wells, but he had a very negative and abusive father. Other abusive fathers. Thomas Hobbes.
Yes.
Famous, probably one of the very first materialist atheists, but he didn't quite come out and say it.
Right,
because
but everybody who read him knew.
Everyone who read him knew, because it was dangerous politically for him to be an atheist then.
Right, yeah.
And, but his father was an Anglican priest, minister, and but was not very respected because his father would fall asleep in his own services.
He put himself to sleep.
I guess. Well, I know. I don't think. Well, it was when other people were doing things. But and then when young Hobbes was between 2 and 3, his father had a fight with a parishioner in front of the church, and knocked him down and beat him up. That is the parishioner. And then he fled.
Right.
Wow.
And he abandoned the family and was never seen again, although the rumor was that he had taken up with another woman on the outskirts of London in a different direction. So it wasn't as though he had died. And so here's Hobbes growing up with a father who's rejected the family and was and it's very clear that although Hobbes was almost certainly as a materialist and atheist, and he didn't say it, he was clearly anti-clerical.
Right.
And it's a no-brainer. Why?
Wow.
Yeah.
I also read, not in your book, that when Hobbes was in utero, his mother somehow witnessed the shelling of the Spanish Armada, and that the convulsions from that event sort of shook young Thomas's world, his foundations, so that right from the beginning there's this streak of instability running through his character. It would account for the Leviathan, for a number of his pronouncements.
It could be. I pass. You know more.
You're not going to venture
Regis, you know
into
more
the
about
womb.
Hobbes than I do.
Well, one of the things I think we're noticing is that atheism, though it has become an epidemic in the last 10 or 15 years, is really rooted in centuries of development, of things that have happened, And you talked earlier, Regis, in the first segment about a revolt against authority. And I think of the paterphobia that was sort of in the water supply practically at the time of the French Revolution. Monarchy and the episcopacy and any father figures were
the
sort of
slaying of the
target.
fathers.
Yeah, and when you look at the battle cry of liberty, fraternity, and equality, I mean, how innocuous is that until you recognize that liberty is really a negation of authority, fraternity is a negation of paternity, and equality is a negation of hierarchy. These are not primarily positive statements, but negations of the very things that they are warring against, And this is why I think it's so important to recognize that the family is not just the father, but as the father goes, so goes the family. So we can glamorize single parenting. And I know a lot of people who tragically find themselves in those difficult circumstances, and God bless them.
Right.
But it goes back before the 70s when Archie Bunker was a kind of caricature of fatherhood.
Yes.
This goes back centuries, and it's gonna take a long time to kind of understand this and rehabilitate it as best as we can, I think.
Look, that's here. That's great.
So that's the historical context. We've got psychology that's pointing to this, that the either the abusive, the dead, the not present father has a huge impact.
Yes.
And do you know if there's any impact? I'm just thinking for the church, like in regards to the priesthood. I don't know if you're familiar with any look at any of the vocational.
I don't know of that. I do know occasionally. I know of a psychiatrist who has done a fair amount of work with priests with psychological issues, and has found maybe 2 or 3 cases of priests who, loved God, accepted God, but hated the Pope. And in those cases, he found that the priest had come in to the faith a lot through the mother, and through other help from other people, but had, I think in all these cases, they were Irish, and they had an alcoholic, abusive father.
Right.
And so what they were doing is shifting the hostility toward God as Father, and they had overcome that, but they shifted it to the Pope, who is Papa. And so we get, different kinds of this. We get shades of it and other expressions of this, and so it's always very complicated in a particular situation as to how it works out.
I know.
I mean, we could analyze this for eternity, I'm quite sure, but I think we have to recognize eventually that the best defense is a good offense. I mean, to raise a healthy family is, to me, the greatest need today, more than publishing this book or that article or anything, any committee project, you know.
Yes, more than making $1 million, all of that kind of stuff. I'm telling you, the highest form of manhood is fatherhood.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a natural father, but you have to father the people that God has put in your life.
Yeah.
And an analogous to that is the highest form of womanhood is motherhood.
Right, that's right.
And all women are called to be mothers, although not necessarily natural mothers. Mother Teresa of Calcutta didn't have any children, in the ordinary sense, but lots of others. Yep. And it's in that, and women understand that about life, I think, much better than men. And men have to recover the notion that manhood doesn't stop with James Bond, where all you do is kill an enemy and sleep with the female Russian spy, and then wake up at age 40 or 50 and your life's a big zilch.
Yeah, right. I don't think the average father realizes the impact. I still, don't fully appreciate the impact that we can have on our children, and really ultimately then the culture. Because if your premise is correct, which I know you are, is that the more that we remove fathers, the more that they are abusive and not taking on their full role, we're damaging the whole of society and generations potentially to come.
Right, and we're setting ourselves up for a cultural father figure who will be a demagogue.
Yeah. An antichrist.
Yeah. We're setting ourselves up for somebody who will fill that vacuum in ways that are going to be very unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk more on how we can look at the positive side of what we're looking at now. Stay with us on Franciscan University Presents.
I think one of the things that makes a really good parent is a parent who is what we call child-centered. And a parent who is child-centered tries to help address their child's needs in a way that meets the developmental needs of their children. And unfortunately, if a parent is too focused on himself or on herself, it can be really difficult to actually be available to your child in the way that they need. And that means the kind of love that they might need, the kind of discipline that they might need, or the kind of learning experiences that actually fit their level rather than a parent's level.
My name is Kelly Butler, and I'm a communication arts major. I took independent digital filmmaking. Definitely intense. Many all-nighters in the editing lab getting things done. Pope John Paul II has a quote, "Do not be afraid to go out into the streets and into public places to preach Christ like the first apostles." That's what we're called to as Catholics and as Christians. You have that responsibility that every work you create should reflect Christ. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Explore the treasures of your Catholic heritage on a Franciscan University pilgrimage. Led by inspiring spiritual directors, you'll walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs in the Holy Land, Poland, France, and Italy, and you'll deepen your love for Jesus Christ through daily Mass, confession, prayer, and the joy of Christian fellowship. Let Franciscan University lead you on a pilgrimage of faith. Find out more at franciscan.edu/pilgrimages.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This entire program springs forth from the very heart of Franciscan University. The program is being recorded right now in our Communication Arts studio here at Franciscan University. The cameras and the equipment are being operated by our students. Our panelists are members of our theology faculty here. We've been talking to Dr. Paul Vitz, author and professor, about Faith of the Fatherless, the Psychology of Atheism. So we've kind of unpacked a lot about atheism and the influences fathers had in their lives. Let's talk about theists, people who are believers, and maybe is there a difference in the relationships or the fathers of some of the theists and those of the atheists?
Yes. Now we're talking again about on average,
Yes,
there's no life being filled with exceptions, but this is the average tendency. And in the book I have a bunch of historically famous atheists, but I also match them against historically prominent theists in the same cultures and time periods. And there I didn't find any of these defective fathers.
Interesting.
I found good fathers or good father substitutes.
So it could be either or.
Yes,
Father
and
figures.
that's something to keep in mind about father substitutes in view of the problem with bad fathers. But Cardinal Newman had a strong positive relationship with his father. G.K. Chesterton did. I don't know how many of you know, Thomas Reed, a famous philosopher, had a very fine relationship with his father. Bishop Butler did. People like, we have in there also all kinds of others. Who would we know that was a famous theist? Well, Bonhoeffer, we could put in there. We could put in Buber. We could put in many others.
Yes.
In other words, I had a...
You could put Karol Wojtyła in there as well, his own father.
Yes.
That was a school of sanctity that he was a student of when he was growing up, witnessing his father on his knees late at night. And after his mother's death, the father was the centerpiece of that family. So humanly responsible, I think, for the vocation that he had.
Yeah.
Right. One famous example, of course, is Blaise Pascal, whose mother died when he was 3, but his father what he did. The father did. He homeschooled him. Now this is back in the.
So it was pro-homeschooling back then.
Way back then. That's all they had in many cases anyway. And he was homeschooled diligently by his father, along with his sister. And he.
It helps to be a genius, though. I mean,
I'm encouraged because here in the studio we have 2 men with 10 kids each. You and I, Paul, have 6 kids each.
Right.
That's right.
And I'd like to think that I have a decent relationship with our 6 kids as well. But I
just try to remember their names.
Nothing has been more frustrating at times for me than fatherhood, and yet nothing comes close to how fulfilling it has been for 31 years as well. And I think I'm not an exception. I think that's generally true for every man I know who always feels inadequacies when he's trying to father his kids at every stage. You never stop fathering, and yet God always seems to kind of make up for what we lack when we turn to Him in prayer to be the perfect father that He alone can be.
That's our fail-safe program. We can call on God because, I was fairly clueless about being a father.
We all were.
Well, I mean, coming out of the 60s, I was, at the time.
That's right, you were an atheist.
I was an atheist, and, I was interested in my career and, that type of thing. I worshipped myself. But, anybody who worships themselves worships a fool.
I think that's scriptural.
I don't know, but it's just true. Anyway.
Well, it's a pretty limited engagement. I mean, how many acts can follow from that?
Yes.
Self-centered self.
But it's the easy, I think C.S. Lewis said something to the effect that the most effective alternative religion to Christianity was self-focused religion. Focus on yourself.
Right.
But fatherhood is precisely what brings about an exodus from those self-worshipping wretches,
Absolutely. And it's painful. That's why men are a little leery of it, because, look, we know motherhood involves sacrifice. Everybody knows that, starting maybe with morning sickness or whatever, and of course labor and stretch marks and being awakened at night and all of that. But that's why mothers are loved and honored.
Yes.
And that's why this is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Well, there's no manhood worthy of the name without sacrifice.
Right.
Yeah.
Now the military still understands this a little bit. The brave men who died for their comrades and in the service of the military action are honored with high medals and with great respect.
And the country also celebrates
Great
Memorial Day, veterans and all of that.
But the ordinary way a man is called to sacrifice is to sacrifice for the people he loves. Isn't going to be a band of brothers over there in Normandy.
Right.
It's going to be the band of his family right here in Middletown, USA.
Right.
And that's where he has to show this sacrifice, self-giving sacrifice.
What does that look like? I mean, because, some people put up an ideal that seems so far to reach of what the perfect father is. As Scott said earlier, so many fathers, I think, feel like there's times where they are not adequate enough for the task. But what would be, from your kind of study and your look, would be some of the qualities we'd really want to look for, or things that they'd want to do? I mean, sacrifice is probably the crux of it, maybe, but what would you say about
Well, I'd say first, don't worry about the times you feel inadequate.
Right.
You're going to feel inadequate. We all feel inadequate about almost any important thing we do.
Yes.
At various times we feel that way.
But not to worry, not to give in to anxiety.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, you feel inadequate, you made a mistake, you don't know what to do, get up and get on with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what your wife is probably doing as a mother when she makes mistakes too. So, what does it mean? First of all, it means being there. Men don't understand
Show
how important being there is. It's not doing something, it's being there.
Right. Yeah.
Second, love your wife.
Yeah.
Love their mother. Show respect for her, because that's the beginning of seeing respect for women in general, with your sons in particular.
Yep.
And it is the feeling of unity between you and your wife that gives the family a sense of a feeling of unity itself.
Right. Yeah.
So, third, show affection to your children.
Yeah.
There's a lot of evidence that the love and support that children give their parents, that the masculinity of the boy and things of that kind are related not to whether the father's a big macho or something like that, but is highly related to whether the father showed the boy or the girl affection.
Yeah.
The femininity of the daughters, too, is affirmed by that kind of physical affection and affirmation.
And if when they're affirmed by their dad, they don't have to run after some 16-year-old boy or 18-year-old boy. He'll show them that they're attractive.
Yeah.
But I think that point you made, we got to return to, and that is worry and anxiety, not to give into it. God gives us all fathers, I like to say, so that we can come to know who He is, but He gives us all fathers with flaws, so we'll never settle for anything less than God. But when we come to face our own flaws, I remember coming across a phrase, I don't remember what the source was, that fatherhood is non-anxious leadership. If it's just leadership, it can be authoritarian and autocratic.
Yeah.
If it's simply non-anxious, it can be really absenteeism.
Right.
But the combination where you recognize that God is fathering through me, so He'll make up for what I lack. I've got to provide leadership, but it's got to be non-anxious. When I worry, everyone in my family gets stressed out. Right. When I can relax and let God work through me, and in spite of me, everybody, my presence then is not a domineering force.
No, you're there to help them. You're there to encourage. You're there to support them. You're there to give of yourself to them.
Yeah, it's a gift. Yeah.
And of course, you can't do that unless you're there. That's the crucial thing, being there. And not about quality time, it's just being there. Maybe you should be there when there's a thunderstorm, because they feel safer because you're there.
And you shouldn't be the thunderstorm.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's ironic that men have to dethrone themselves to really find themselves.
Yeah.
That we're launching pads, we're not rocket ships. Our kids are the rockets that we want to launch.
Yeah, that's right.
And we end up being far more fulfilled in their successes. I remember when my dad was an agnostic, and he came to my graduation, and I got this award or that. And he teared up, and I'd never seen him tear up in my whole life. And he's like, I succeeded in my business more than I ever expected. But then he said, I am feeling greater satisfaction on this day than in my whole life. And I'm like, that just didn't make any sense until years later when I became a father. And then I called him up, and I'm like, I get it. I'm finally beginning to get it.
Get it. Yeah. And so recognize it is self-giving sacrifice.
Yeah.
That this is what fatherhood is, and this is how you get above men who are, shall we say, fixated on just sex and violence as what masculinity is about.
Right. Yeah, I don't want to excuse poor fatherhood, but it does seem to me that women have an edge. They have a natural advantage because they're so constituted that God has placed them closer to the mystery of life than men. They don't have to step out of themselves to be feminine, to be maternal. They're reminded every month of this immense capacity to procreate. Yes. But in men, there's a certain externality that has to be overcome. Women help us. They civilize the men they marry. But it is sort of unnatural to be a father. You go against the grain of your own selfishness.
Yes, but as it comes from an old movie, nature is what we were born to rise above.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
That is, men are called to rise above this nature, and in doing this, they will be shaping the culture in a way that women won't have been.
Right. Yeah.
Women are providing the people who can even survive, but now the culture has to incorporate this, and self-giving fatherhood is the way to move forward positively out of the mess we're in.
Right. And by the way, I think you're making a contribution that in psychology, because in theological studies, I've been focusing on covenant as family and fatherhood and all of this. I remember taking one required psychology course, and we heard all about Freud and the Oedipal complex, and fatherhood. Then we studied Adler, and we saw that sibling relations mattered more for him than for Freud. And then Jung and the archetypes, and especially the maternal archetypes. Yes. And it just struck me that we're fragmenting the family. We got fatherhood here, motherhood there, siblings there, but nobody was attempting a holistic reappropriation of family life. Yeah. It was like looking at all of the breakdown aspects. But this is where I think your work comes in, and other people too at the Institute there in Virginia. Yeah. And it's a constructive effort that is sorely needed, and it's not coming too soon.
Well, anyway, it's really clear that psychology more and more needs synthesis.
Right.
The analysis is over, and we need now to begin to put things together. And there are some good secular psychologists out there doing some stuff too, particularly the work on the virtues pioneered by Martin Seligman, and many others now. Psychology doesn't know it, but it's in discovering the virtues. And this is something very important for men, because men like the challenge of virtues and becoming strong in the sense of brave or courageous, and becoming just, and becoming prudent and wise, and becoming temperate. That challenge is changing psychology from determinism to teleology. It's changing psychology from a Galilean understanding of science to an Aristotelian one.
Well, they're backing into something beautiful.
Yes, and they're doing it. They're backing in, and they don't even know where they're backing into.
And the point is that the virtues are to the soul what muscles are to the body. They make the vir, the man. And to see that strength, I think, is really going to be a huge breakthrough of psychological finish.
And that's
how
why to be hopeful.
Is this, Paul?
Not nearly enough.
You're pretty optimistic. How widespread is this new discovery of virtue?
It's pretty widespread in psychology. It has yet to seep down into things like education or the culture, but it's widespread.
That's exciting. You won't want to miss our last segment here on Franciscan University Presents. Stay with us.
Jesus is the embodiment of true fatherhood, or what the famous developmental psychologist Erik Erikson would have called generativity, which is the expression of the virtue of care in passing on to the next generation life and culture and lasting values. And that's a calling that's open to every man, regardless of whether he has biological children. And whenever a man, in whatever ways are appropriate to him, gives himself to others and for others in a good, healthy way, he is fulfilling fatherhood and true manhood.
My name is Joseph Grelich. I'm a chemistry major, biology minor here at Franciscan University. I love the atmosphere, just completely centered around the Catholic faith. When I play soccer, when I'm in classes, everything has that same Catholic attitude. Myself and a few other chemistry majors have the opportunity to work with top scientists in order to combat neglected diseases. I was able to connect my love for chemistry and also my love for mission work by synthesizing chemical compounds. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This is our final segment. We've been talking about faith of the fatherless, the psychology of atheism with Dr. Paul Vitz. Regis, could you start us off?
Yeah, I'm so delighted, Paul, that you came to talk to us. I find your ideas infectious.
Thank you.
Really,
Thank you.
really exhilarating. And they sort of go against the grain of my own native pessimism about our prospects. But I'm delighted that you're spearheading this renaissance of genuine recovery in the psychological disciplines. That's gratifying to see. I'm struck by a couple of distinctions that we didn't really parse in the conversation. You were talking about narcissism, and you describe it as if it were a malady, a disease, a disorder. There's something really pathological about it, which suggests that maybe people are helpless to get out of it. And the distinction I would want to draw is between that, the illness, and solipsism, which is a kind of philosophical heresy that declares the self to be the center of the cosmos. What Dean Fitch, a wonderful Protestant theologian, described as the odyssey of the self-centered self. And I'm just wondering if the atheists who are driven by an ideology of hatred for a God, is it a function of narcissism, or has it somehow hardened into a heresy, a sin, which we call solipsism? And the other distinction that I would make is between unbelief, which some people have. I just can't believe in this stuff. I can't sustain the evidence. And disbelief, which tends to be more aggressive, virulent. That prefix, dis, I think is revelatory, because he was the god of the underworld in classical mythology. And the word means separation, division, negation, suppression. And that's willful. I mean, that's where atheism, I think, begins in the human heart. This necessity driven by the will to displace God, because there's no room for both of us, and I need to be God.
Right.
So if you can address that, maybe in your next book.
Yeah, I would just say, what I can do now is say, yes, here, those are fine distinctions, and I would go with them. In any given case, you'd have to know whether you're talking about unbelief or disbelief or narcissism or solipsism. And you'd have to ask questions. I'd like to point out that a lot of atheists don't fit into either the autistic intensity or the faith of the fatherless intensity, but they're just ordinary atheists who are atheists for convenience, because it's the better way to get ahead without offending anybody that they think might be an unbeliever or something of that kind. And then there are some people who are atheists because their parents or their fathers were believers, but not dysfunctional, but where their fathers and their family is embarrassing. You know,
they're mortified.
They're mortified by their Pentecostal family. They're mortified by their fundamentalist family. They're mortified by this devout Catholic family where their father prayed the rosary. You know, they find all of that humiliating in a social sense. Now that they're at the university, now that they're in Silicon Valley and with all these fancy people.
They hit a stride. They got to emerge from all of that.
So they've got to emerge from this lower class, simple-minded family. And so that's why they're atheists, and they may not be in any way rejecting their father or mother per se. It's just that the whole thing gives them the creeps.
Yeah. Scott, would you like to ask?
Yeah, I appreciate the way you wrap things up so fairly, because it really helps to recognize that atheism is not a reductionist sort of study. And this is something that you've been doing. And again, I don't want to flatter or embarrass you, but I've been looking at your work now since the late 70s when you came out with a book that was assigned in a course that I had as an undergraduate, Psychology as Religion. And it was really a breakthrough for me to see this kind of cult of self-worship. I had taken the required psychology course and I could see what it was you were describing. But since that time, you've also done constructive work, such as, Faith of the Fatherless. And I think the most constructive work all of us are engaged in right now could be summed up in the new evangelization. Proclaiming Christ, and as Pope Benedict pointed out in his book, Jesus of Nazareth, you can sum up Christianity in one word, and that is Father. Jesus came to show us the Father. If you have seen me, you've seen the Father. So the more we can draw people closer to Christ, the more they can discover that the source of being, The governor of the universe, the master of the whole world, is Abba, Father. And that has to transform us, interior and then in all of our relations as well. You know, and I think that will provide the counterbalance to that kind of analysis that says, look what happens when you don't raise a good family,
Yes.
when you don't know God as Father. And this is where your work has a huge contribution to make, I'm convinced.
Yeah.
Well, I hope so, but you never know. And I would say this as a finale, that fathers are called, the basic call of the father is to love. And you don't argue with an atheist, you don't argue with somebody who doesn't have belief. You show love to them.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental language that can make the difference. And that's the language that all fathers should show to their wife and to their children.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. If you've enjoyed today's program, this has just been, there's so much more that we could be unpacking here, but we have a free handout for you. Freud and the Psychology of Atheism gives going deeper a little bit into some of the subject we talked about here today. Available at faithandreason.com or just for asking. When we think about fathers, I just want to just briefly touch and say, don't worry. Don't worry about being perfect. Be present. And keep it simple, just show up and be present for your children or grandfathers. Or if in your parish or in your community there's a single mom struggling with that, step in. Be the father for her children in a powerful way. There's so many opportunities in this world with so many fatherless out there, walking wounded, and we can be, as Dr. Vitz said, we can be that loving presence for them. And then even thinking just about atheists in general. It's not always an intellectual discussion or argument that they need, but they need love. And maybe it is many wounds of their fathers or other situations. That love is the language that we as Christians need to speak in this new evangelization. So go and be present to your family, to those in need, and bring love, because that's primarily what our world is longing for, who is Jesus Christ. So thank you for watching today's program. This is a program that springs forth from Franciscan University's desire to fulfill our mission, which is forming those who will go out to transform the world. And we want to invite you to be a part of that life-saving mission, possibly by coming here to study here on our campus, or through our online or distance education, or maybe joining us at one of our summer conferences or our pilgrimages to holy shrines around the world, or be equipped through a new website that we launched, faithandreason.com, where there are videos, articles, insights that will give you the materials and the inspiration you need to be active in the new evangelization. So thank you for watching, and until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
To download the free handout on today's topic, go to faithandreason.com. Email your request for the handout to presents@franciscan.edu. At faithandreason.com, you can also purchase past episodes of Franciscan University Presents, or request today's free handout and purchase past programs by calling 888-333-0381. That's 888-333-0381, or call 740-283-6357.